Hi, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this webinar. My name is Rocio Molina, and I'm the Deputy Director at the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project. Today, our title of the webinar is Offender-Focused Investigations and Prosecutions of Domestic and Sexual Violence Involving Immigrant Victims. So with that, today we have Michael LaRivere, an investigator from the Salem Police Department, and Jane Anderson from AEquitas. And I'll turn it over to our presenters. Thank you for being with us today.
Mike, do you want to start us off? Yeah.
Want me to start us off? Well, welcome everybody. We're excited to have this hour and hopefully hour and a half with everyone with our question and answer session that'll be after. And we're going to share some great information. As you see on the slide there, if you're looking at the slide, I work as a police officer in Salem, Massachusetts. I worked there a little over 32 years and retired about 4 years ago, but still very much involved in a different role and doing a lot of these national trainings with Rocio, Jane, and all the rest of the staff and the support staff that we have here helping us out today. So thank you. I don't want to take up any more time. We only have an hour, so I'm going to lead it over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Mike. I'm Jane Anderson. I'm a senior attorney advisor with AEquitas. We've been proud partners of NUOP for a really long time, and I've been working with Mike and Rocio and the team. And this is one of the topics that's near and dear to our heart, which is not only how can we support immigrant victims through the criminal justice system, but how can we really set ourselves up for success when we investigate and look forward to the prosecution of really complex crimes of domestic violence and sexual violence. So we're really proud to be supported. And Rocio, I know this is both you and I grants through both of us through OVW get funding that supports this type of webinar and the resources and the training and technical assistance that we can provide the field. So we want to thank the Office of Violence Against Women for their continued support, and of course, give the caveat that not everything Mike in particular says, but Mike and I say, of course, is not necessarily reflecting their views. Ro, do you want to tell us a little bit more about generally what NUOP does and how they can support the field?
Yes, so we provide technical assistance to local, state, and federal law enforcement prosecutors, victim advocates, judges, attorneys, and other professionals. And so really, there really isn't anyone that reaches out to us that we turn away. If you're working to better your work and response with immigrant survivors and crime victims, we're here to serve you. We can provide training and technical assistance, and we're actually looking at sites where to go visit next year. So do reach out to us. Our information will be at the last slide. And so reach out to me and I can help you with coordinating that. And we're here to support your work, and it's peer training and multidisciplinary. So you might see their Mike or Jane come out to your city. And if what you have is just an hour to do virtual training, then we can do that as well.
Thanks.
And here's, our resource library. We have a web library that has a lot of materials and a real easy search function to search. If you're looking something on U visa certification or a law or a statute, you just put it there in the search function and you'll find a ton of stuff on that topic. And then you can contact us for one-to-one technical assistance and we'll connect you with the appropriate expert to answer your question.
I think too, Rocio, just to point out, I've even used it myself a couple of times. You call the number, it's fairly live responding, where if you had something going on, a crisis you were dealing with and you needed some, assistance with overcoming some of the things that were happening, you call that number and it's a pretty fast process for the staff to get a hold of one of us. We have a big team. It's not just Jane and I and Rocio to get on the phone with you and try to work you through some of the things that are going on. So I highly recommend having that number handy in your office and your phone, so you have that in case something just happens unexpectedly.
And we'll talk a lot about the collaboration that's required to really build up this response. And so if you're on this call and your role is victim services, or you're running a SART or something like that, and someone else on your team is dealing with an issue, please share that widely. I think Really commonly, I'll have folks reach out for technical assistance because one of their counterparts heard a training and now they're, letting the prosecutor know, hey, I heard that there's something you can do to help with prosecutions when, somebody's been given a U visa. And not only do we have those written resources, but I'm happy to walk through jury selection strategies that are really case specific. So that's just an opportunity that is very tailored and responsive. So I encourage you guys to not only think of it for yourself, but for your teams. So while I've been partnering with NewUp for a really long time, and sometimes I feel like they're my bosses, I actually work for an organization called AEquitas. We're funded through various federal grants, including the Office on Violence Against Women. And we're funded as primarily former prosecutors that had specialized careers handling cases of domestic violence, stalking, sexual violence, and human trafficking. And we're here to help. So hopefully we can provide you all with really innovative and informed strategies. So that's the latest social science, the latest research, the latest case law, but also what we learned from all of you and the field of like what's happening, what might be common challenges that you're seeing in court or something like that. And then we can build responses and share it with the rest of the field. And we really pride ourselves in having practical strategies. So things that you can really take and apply to your work right away. So we've got, similar to NewUp, our website has a ton of written resources and we're available for one-on-one consultations, trainings, and we work on a lot of partnerships. So you might be working in a jurisdiction where we're supporting a sexual assault kit initiative or enhanced collaborative partnership, human trafficking task force, or lots of other federally funded projects. So just keep us in mind as an ongoing resource. And without further ado.
Thanks, Jane. So this is where we're at. This is what we're going to hope to accomplish today and in this 1 hour and extend on that with some Q&As after. Identifying the tactics that offenders use to assert power and control over immigrant victims of domestic and sexual violence, how to utilize the relief that we'll talk about that will enhance your investigations, helping with community safety, victim safety, and others as well, responders. And then with the help of Jane, we're going to develop some prosecutorial strategies that can overcome some of the defenses that come up in the cases that you may have in court that involve immigrant victims. So a lot of really cool and really important stuff to have in that toolbox that you carry around every single day when you do the things that you do.
So Mike and I host virtual roundtables for law enforcement and prosecutors on a fairly regular basis. I think they're probably about bi-monthly, and they're usually closed roundtables just for law enforcement and prosecutors to maybe share some case-specific information with Mike and I being able to help walk them through that. But today we have a really unique opportunity, which is that we're kind of pushing together this webinar along with our roundtable. So immediately following this webinar, we're going to open up a Zoom roundtable and have an interactive conversation about some of the things that might be popping up as a result of the information we share today. But if you are a law enforcement prosecutor or you're a systems-based advocate working within one of those agencies and you want to register for our ongoing roundtables, please do so. But more importantly, today we'll send you a link and hopefully we can get a lot of you guys to move right on over to the roundtable. Okay, so when we say offender focused, Mike, I feel like I say this to law enforcement a lot and they're like, offender focused, that means, like putting people in jail. And while offender accountability is definitely a piece of what it means to be offender focused, I think importantly, from the perspective of how do we investigate these cases and how do we set up our prosecutions, the definition that we use is more about how do we focus our investigation onto who is the defendant or the offender? What are the actions that they're taking? What are the tactics that they're using to manipulate, to assert power and control? What is their behavior? Instead of what we typically see at trial might be sort of this victim blaming stance of like, oh, the victim did that, the victim didn't do that, the victim should have done that. It's really trying to control the narrative and shine the spotlight where it deserves to be firmly affixed, and that is on the offender and their behavior, tactics, actions, etc. And the other thing is when we do that, it helps us frame those, victim behaviors that might originally seem like maybe they're challenging or we don't understand them. Well, what we learn from this is that those victim behaviors are actually very normal responses, or common responses to the trauma that an offender is inflicting. So trying to keep that focus on it. And I know, Mike, when you're investigating a DV case, having to make sure that, you and those you supervise and those you help, like, keep that focus on the offender and what they're doing instead of sort of overly fixating on the victim.
Yeah, and I mean, I think all that we do is victim centered. I mean, that's the ultimate goal of all the investigations that we take on. But in order to do it effectively in the arena, the umbrella that we're talking about today, you really need to have focus on the offender and like you said, Jane, the tactics and the things that are happening that the offender are doing to uh, affect the survivor, the victim, and how they're responding to the system and to the resources available and all the other things in between. So we're never going to forget about being victim centered, but we really do need to focus on the offender's actions and tactics to get us there.
Yeah, and I think that sort of adds to that idea of where's the collaboration, right? So all of our multidisciplinary partners have sort of the same general mission, the same general goals, but we do have various roles and responsibilities with that. So with law enforcement being victim-centered, a lot of that's about referrals, about how you are conducting your interviews. But at the same time, you guys have a distinct role, and prosecutors too, of like holding offenders accountable and making sure that we're presenting an effective presentation of evidence to our judges and juries. So I think this is one of the strongest tools that we have to remind ourselves of looking beyond maybe the act that brought us to the scene, right? So, Mike, what's a common, reason why you would come across, let's say, a domestic violence scene? You've got a 911 call.
Yeah, 911 call.
And what's
Yeah.
the complaint on the 911 call?
Well, it depends who it's coming from, but oftentimes it's somebody in the house or the victim themselves just saying, "Help me, something's going on that I need help with," and there's a bunch of stuff that could be said depending on what's happening. But the things I think where you're getting at, Jane, the things that we see in this power and control wheel are things that, quite frankly, are present in the interactions even that our call takers have. That's why call taking is like so critically important in this collaborative process where they're the first ones on the scene, whether they're civilian or not. They're investigators, they're collecting information, they're identifying dynamics, tactics, that type of stuff.
Yeah, and what I was actually getting at, but I think you did what you want better, was that the sort of like outer ring of this wheel is usually, in my experience at least,
They
what the
hit me
call is
physically.
about. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, right.
I went deeper into it.
I know, because you're so victim centered, Mike. That's why. But yeah, that's usually what brings police response, is that there is this acute incident of physical or sexual violence. And then, of course, as it makes sense, like that's what our immediate response is about. Like, do you need medical care? Are you okay? Like, what did that violence look like? And I think what this wheel reminds us to do is to make sure that we are kind of cluing into these other tactics that might be presented to us immediately on the scene, like a call taker might experience and even hear, threats or coercion or intimidation. But a lot of times some of these things come out in their first conversations with victim services or with a secondary interview by a detective who's really taking the time not just to address the immediate, reason why we got a 911 call, but what is the nature of that relationship?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, one of the reasons why, even when we talk about multidisciplinary by discipline, even within law enforcement, there are different roles, right? It looks different if a patrol officer is responding to a call versus a detective that's being called in later on to try to do this more comprehensive investigation. So the questions that you ask on the scene are going to be a little bit different than the questions you ask maybe later on. And Mike, I don't know if you can describe a little bit about like that exigency versus the investigatory interview.
Yeah. So are you aiming towards like the language access portion of it, or?
Yeah, or just like kind
Yeah.
of digging into some of these more nuanced versions of power and control. But yeah, language is going to be
Yeah.
really key here.
We have that window where there's exigency happen here, and we have to get this information. It might be our only time to get this information from the individual, whether it's a witness, a victim, survivor. So in that critical point, I already mentioned the call takers, but when officers arrive on scene and they have that initial interaction, you have to have that tools in that toolbox I always talk about to get through that. And that's why the minute you say that exigent word, I think of language access, because we know that that's a critical point in time in the language access kind of flow where you could use any individual, the best person available to you on that scene to get critical information. But once it turns into a point where you're doing an investigation, you're collecting evidence, you need to use a qualified interpreter. But they have the tools in your toolbox, whether it be protocols and procedures in place of how you're going to navigate through language access when you're on scene. Quite frankly, the training like you're having today, like training on the dynamics of domestic violence and the the additional barriers and tactics and dynamics that are in place when you have an undocumented individual that is a victim, survivor, or witness. So yeah, I think that this work that is so important to all of us has to happen collaboratively and with those toolboxes full of really good resources to pull out of any situation that you're in. You can't do this on the fly. You can't all of a sudden in your community be like, oh my God, well, we're having trouble interacting. Or, she's not cooperating with our investigation, and not have the stuff that you can pull out, whether it's your training, resources that you have learned about that you can utilize, at the scene and during the investigation. Another
I think
deep dive in your question. You want to ask me questions, and you know me, I'm a talker. You have to put some tape on.
No, I love it, because what I want to talk about next is these tactics that aren't going to be maybe the most obvious things that we see when we respond to a scene. They are going to be the things that a jury and a judge wants to hear about. So as a former prosecutor, I'm thinking about how am I going to present this full story to my judge and my jury so that they really understand the nature of the relationship. And the nature of the relationship, of course, involves physical and sexual violence, but what really paints it so that the reality of the situation comes alive to our fact finders is all of these other tactics that are used, these power and control. And so I like using this wheel as a way to remind myself of like all the different things I want to ask the victim. Because if I'm working with a victim survivor, I'm going to be focused on, can I make the elements of my case? And if it's a assault and battery case, I'm like, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard this before, like, was it his left or right hand? Was it an open or closed fist? And those are things that I maybe need to know for like making my elements of the case, but they're not going to be the things that are really going to get the jury on the side of the victim. What I want the jury to hear is that nature of the relationship. And if I don't ask the right questions, and if I'm not working with really great detectives and victim services that are helping me better understand this relationship, I may miss that, yes, this was a thing of physical violence, but the reason why she hasn't come forward before, or the reason why he was afraid to call the police, is really more about the economic abuse that's happening at home. And if I don't know that, and I don't have access to that information or evidence to support that, I'm missing such a big part of the story. So this wheel reminds me to proactively be asking about all these other tactics. And when it comes to immigrant victims, what this reminds me to do, and I encourage you all to kind of take this power and control wheel, if you don't already have it printed at your desk, do that. And then think about, okay, what does each of these spokes of the wheel, what does it look like for an immigrant victim? What does it look like for a victim that doesn't speak English? Right? Because it looks different. Using economic abuse, that's a common tactic. But if you overlay that with the fact that someone is undocumented or that someone doesn't speak English, it really exacerbates the effect of that tactic, right? So not only is the offender the only or the primary person in charge of the income, but the victim couldn't even get a job legally if they wanted to. That really makes it a different, kind of level of power and control, and that economic abuse spoke. So we want to know that. We want to be able to share that, because that's really probably going to go a long way to explain maybe some of those victim behaviors that originally don't seem like intuitive to our judge and our jury, who's never even thought about, like, why didn't he or she just leave and get a job and, like, go about their things and escape this abusive situation.
The intimidation too, Jane, is like
Yep.
it's magnified, extremely magnified when you're undocumented, and we think about using children a lot in domestic violence cases, but when that using the children is also intimidation and threats around being separated from them to the point where you're deported out of the country, or intimidation, not just to the household that offender is controlling, but has contacts back in the home country with bad individuals that this person is using that intimidation and threats to control those individuals, so to keep their family and their friends and their relatives safe in their home country, that type of stuff.
Yeah, so normally if we're like doing this in a group, we have sort of small groups work on each of these spokes of the wheel to think about it really intentionally. And I'd say I do typically redact on the using male privilege. I usually just redact the male because it's really using any amount of privilege. And in this case, it might be privilege that one person is documented and one person's not.
Mhm.
One person speaks the language better than the other person. And so that's a real way that privilege in this context could play itself out. Similarly, isolation. Of course, these are tactics used in every battering relationship, but what if isolation also means you don't have a community, that the offender's family is the only one that can care for your children, that the local church that that everyone in your little micro community goes to, and everybody knows everybody. And so isolation can look a lot differently. The lack of being able to speak English might be isolating in certain communities. So be really intentional in thinking about this, how it affects the victims that you serve. And then this is just another version of the wheel. As many of you probably know, that wheel was created by the Duluth Project years ago, and now we're seeing a lot of folks take it and kind of expand and grow upon it. So this one was adapted from that, and it is specific to immigrant victims, and physical abuse and sexual abuse, economic abuse, and it kind of adds the secondary layer, which I think is what we were kind of encouraging you to do as well. So if you don't have access to these wheels, we're happy to send you links, or a quick Google search will find them. But there's also ones for non-English speaking LGBTQ plus people. And it's been really great to see how the power and control wheel has been adapted to be more culturally specific and address different populations. So
on that
Mike,
note,
yeah,
yeah,
I know.
let's just take just a quick bit here and just come through some specific tactics that offenders may be utilizing to maintain that power and control over immigrant victims. So just some things maybe you've experienced in your time.
Karen's got a great comment here, which is that thinking about what it looks like if they're in a rural area,
Mhm.
and how isolation can
Yeah.
be, even greater if there's this distance and services are not so immediately available. And I think one of the things that COVID had some positive effect on is really increasing ability for victims to seek assistance online, but then that means that they have to have access to it, and what if it's being monitored and all those
Mhm.
things too. So that's a great point.
So again, we have 1 hour, so we obviously don't have a ton of time for these
Keep them
interactive
coming.
slides. But if you can comment on this, I mean, I mentioned a couple. I mentioned, using the children and the threat of deportation and separation from the kids, and intimidating based on, um, either actual or perceived ability of the offender to harm family members, friends, others in their home country. But there's definitely a much larger pool of tactics that these offenders utilize on these individuals because of their immigrant status and that they're immigrant victims.
And and I think one of the things to think about is also that if the offender has immigration status, is even a U.S. citizenship, has a U.S. citizenship, like we have some research NUOP has about how they don't file paperwork that they're otherwise could legally file paperwork for on behalf of their partner, and that they delay doing that. Why do they do that? To continue to have that increased power and control over them. So really kind of be very thoughtful about it. And the other thing I'd say is that when we go to a training and I think, what are the threats, Mike? What does everyone say? Threats of deportation.
That's number one.
Yeah, but like I just encourage you to think deeper. And Mike, you pulled some of this out because it's not just deportation. It's what does deportation mean to them? And that's the question, because if you go in, I'm thinking about the prosecutor, depending on where you are in the country, you're going to have different obstacles. But if all you say is their fear of deportation, you're going to have juries that are like, okay, well, great, they should be deported, like frankly. So what you need to start doing is thinking about what does deportation mean? Now there's some jury selection strategies as well. Thank you, Asana, if I'm pronouncing your name right. Sometimes deportation means death. Often it means family separation, especially if the children are US citizens. It means financial ruin. It means gang violence. It means all of that's how you have to kind of be ready to articulate it. So that's a great point.
And one of the things, to have in that toolbox I talk about is knowledge about the relief that's out there. Because in reality, this threat of deportation, of fear of deportation and separation, that is such a powerful tactic that's being used by these offenders, isn't actual. Because as victims of these crimes, reaching out to the resources and reporting crimes to us, that deportation may not even be present, that possibility. So
yeah, not to bury the
versus being a
lead.
U visa. I mean,
Yeah,
you get protection
U
from
visa.
deportation. When you're a victim of the crimes we're talking about, you are very likely to get protection from deportation.
Yep. Blanca, I think you're right on there too. It means even more violence and even more threats to their family and themselves. So that wheel, I think, is super helpful, particularly in cases involving domestic intimate partner violence. This is sort of a similar way that I like to look at so the perfect plan of a sexual offender. And I use this for human trafficking as well. And it can be used for other things. It's pretty simple, and I did not make it up. I credit my colleague Patty Powers and probably many others before me. But it's this idea of, from the offender's point of view, remember that offender focus. If they're looking to abuse, exploit, harm someone, the perfect plan for them is somebody that they have access to, somebody that has a vulnerability already, or somebody that they can instill a vulnerability into, and somebody that they think no one will believe, or that they think that person doesn't think anyone will believe them. So let me walk you through that. So accessibility, I'm going to just do something. Well, first off, an intimate partner is the ultimate person that someone has access to, right? They're living in the home together. So that's somebody you have access with. Somebody that's vulnerable, somebody that doesn't have documentation, that doesn't have papers to work legally, somebody that is in fearful, huge vulnerabilities, language ability, those are vulnerabilities. And then from the perception of the offender, this perceived lackability or lack of credibility, that plays itself out as this person will never go to the police. This person, if they went to the police, would not be believed. Or this person, if went to the police, would not be able to continue on in an investigation and prosecution because of these vulnerabilities. So that's the perfect plan from the point of view of the sexual offender. And again, it's incumbent upon us to see that for what it is. Like the offender picked this victim. So we call like victim selection. They picked this victim because they had access. They they could exploit easily because of the vulnerability, and they can get away with it, or they think they can get away with it. And that's that place right there in that last one, which is where Mike comes in with his toolbox and says, you know what? Just because somebody's undocumented, and just because somebody is fearful, and just because somebody is not readily able to speak English, that doesn't matter. We've got a toolbox. That person still shouldn't be this perfect prey for this offender. Instead, let's think about the tools that we have of language access and immigration relief. And let's break this cycle and not allow offenders to get away with their plan here. So, I think we've kind of hit this, Mike, those challenges,
Yes.
and we really want to focus on solutions. So, how long have you been sort of making sure that you are, sort of overcoming these barriers, and like first started working with folks on U visas and making sure they have those resources?
You're asking me?
Yes. I mean, I feel
A
like
long time.
I saw that picture of
It's
you and I was like, wow, that was baby Mike.
yeah, probably like the very mid '90s. I think I started when we were one of the first grantees to open up a specialized unit with domestic violence, and then progressed over the years till God. Rosia would have the answer on the immigration work, but it's at least a decade more.
Yeah.
I'm not the best when it comes to the years, like how many is you're
Well,
so
it's hard when
overwhelmed
it's
and
your
busy
age.
and focused. I forget what day it is half the time, but it's been a long time. Right, 32-year career, probably about I don't know, 20,
Yeah.
22 years of doing this work.
And I think you probably see a lot of those challenges. Like that's again trying to reframe the issue of like that yes, that's challenging to law enforcement, but what does it really mean when victims um, you know, don't return phone calls, or from our perception, they're not willing to participate? I always like to
Yeah.
reframe it as an inability to participate, because if we really think about it, like they have lots of good reasons for not wanting to participate.
Right.
And you say that all the time, that victims have a lot of good reasons, and these are some of them, I think. And fear
And we're
is a
not always going to
massive bucket.
understand
Yeah.
them.
Yep.
We're not always going to understand those reasons. We need to acknowledge and recognize that, there may be reasons there that are very personal and um, we can't fully wrap our heads around. But that doesn't mean that we can't do everything in our power to learn and, gather resources and tools that we can overcome these things. And it's never too late. I'll tell you, I mean, on all those years you just asked me about, um, God, we were doing language access not real well up until probably like the last 7 years of my career. We utilized bilingual staff and officers to help us interpret, which, as we know, without some form of training around what it means to be an interpreter, and that you're not doing it the right way. And you're probably not getting the message across or received from the individuals when you're not using someone that's understands what it means to be an interpreter. So, I mean, yeah, always important to keep the door open and an open mind to learning some new things, tactics. I mean, we have tactics too, but the best part
Yeah.
is our tactics aren't used in bad ways. We use our tactics to navigate through these barriers that are in place in these investigations and prosecutions. And there's a ton of them out there, and they're constantly being adapted and changed, just like the wheel. I mean, look at the wheel, and God, the wheel
Hmm.
is something that we've both, Jane, been using for decades, and we have new versions of it now, and they're better and they're more informative, and they're clearer to individuals that may see them for the first time. So I guess
Yeah.
that's
And
my
I like
soapbox on that question.
well, and I love how Anne just put it up here too, because it sets it up for this, which is the court system is really intimidating and it's a lot of work. And so, and I think that's why we say inability to participate. It's because we don't know what's going on with everyone. And it's to keep the onus on us and our continued need to recognize that these fears and barriers are huge. The system itself can be a barrier. So how can we take it upon ourselves to start minimizing those. And it's not going to be perfect, but two of our biggest tools are immigration relief and language access. If we are not using those tools, I don't understand how anyone could think that an immigrant victim of domestic violence and sexual violence could possibly participate with us through an investigation, through that court system, through the prosecution of a crime. Like, we need to do this if we're going to be successful. And we need to do lots of other things as well. And they are made for us. Specifically, these immigration relief tools, if you look at the sort of legislative history of why they exist because we want to, from the law enforcement perspective, not to sound selfish, because there's lots of really positive benefits for the victim survivors, but we want to have a case at the end of the day. We want to know about crimes that are happening in our community. We want our community to feel safe. We don't want dangerous offenders to think they can just, kind of victimize a certain part of our community just without any repercussions. So we want to enhance those investigations and prosecutions, and we want to build those relationships. And that's what this tool is for.
And so right. And it just, I read that a couple of times, and it's just these thoughts going through my head. I've thought about, and as you, Jane, we like to travel and kind of go off the beaten path. And I've had several occasions where, I've plopped myself into another country where English certainly isn't the first language. And there you are on vacation. You're there to experience the culture. And in 10 minutes, you get that feel of helplessness. Like, I don't even know how to find out where the bus stop is, or how do I get the right train. And that's, you're there just, as a active participant in this experience. Imagine, as Ann says, if you are now in that same position, but you're a victim of a crime. You're being intimidated. You're being, suppressed in your situation. How do you get out of that? When, I can remember being in a panic state trying to figure out how I was going to find a bus line that I need to get to so I can get to my next destination, Anyway,
Yes,
I'm
travel.
thinking out loud, but it
think
just
you're
really
right.
goes to show how these tactics that these offenders are using are very powerful and real in the moment. And we just luckily happen to be in this situation where if we fill that toolbox, have those resources, we can help get that person out of that situation into a comfortable place where they feel okay talking to us and recognizing that, it's not going to be the, pull the parachute cord because you call the police, and next thing you know, you're going to be on a plane going back to your country as, being deported. And here's one of them. I mean, here is the U visa, which is an incredible crime fighting tool. We talk about that all the time. It was put together as a crime fighting tool to assist, not just the victims, but the officers and the prosecutors in communities, keeping the community safe and getting really bad individuals off the streets. And it's something everybody that's with us here should, have in that toolbox and share with every colleague that you can get an ear of, is how important this work is. It's not required. This is something that we have to buy into as a resource. And I'll tell you from personal experiences, when you put this in place, it's a game changer in your community with your immigrant population in your community and those that might visit your community. So to be eligible for a U visa, you have to meet some basic requirements. And you can see here, the victim has to be a victim of a qualifying criminal activity. We'll show you that list after this. They have to have information about that crime. And the crime has to have occurred in the U.S. or violated U.S. law. That's pretty standard, straightforward, right? All right, I was a victim of a certain crime. Typically, you're going to have some information. I mean, it doesn't have to be detailed conviction type information, just some form of information. And it has to happen within the territory of the U.S. The victim has to be helpful. And that's what we have here is helpfulness. They have to have been helpful or are being helpful or are likely to be helpful in one of these areas: detection, investigation, prosecution, conviction, or sentencing. The important pieces of this is it's not and. So you could just call 911 and say, help, help, help. My boyfriend's, abusing me. And you go there and that person tells you what happened and lets you take a photograph of a bruise mark or something. That is certainly okay for us to sign a U visa certification, us on our end, on our role. And then the harm has to be substantial physical or mental abuse as a result of being a victim of that crime. This is important as it relates to this individual, the survivor, getting the relief that they're requesting. It's not so important for us as certifying officials to have that box checked, that harm box checked before we sign off on the certification. So it's important if you have information to show substantial physical harm, like photographs or medical, releases, things that like from the EMTs or paramedics, that type of stuff. But if you can't check that box, it's really not a box that we're required to check. That's what USCIS will do on their end when they get the packet. So that's a quick version on that. I'm sure there might be some questions, but we can handle those on the next half hour we have together. And here are the qualifying criminal activities. And I always say, like, we're not talking about shoplifters here, thieves, that type of stuff. These are some of the most violent and horrible crimes that can be committed on an individual when you look at this list. It just so happens that the work that, Jane and I, and probably a lot of you on this call have done for a good part of your career has been around domestic violence and sexual assault, which both are qualifying criminal activities. It doesn't necessarily have to be the actual, crime. It could be something that has the same elements. It does, like it says here, includes attempt, conspiracy, or solicitation to commit these crimes. And if anybody has any questions about any of the things that are on here, certainly throw it in the box and we can either answer it quick or answer it our next half hour. So these are frequently asked questions, and there's a bunch. These are the three big ones. We get these questions pretty frequently in our webinars, in our in-person trainings. What if the defendant is never identified, arrested, or prosecuted? Without even like looking at words on this slide, the quick version of this relief isn't a relief that's supposed to be geared towards us getting convictions, us making arrests, us identifying individuals. We want to do that. We want to collect information enough to make an arrest. And Jane, I know you want to get a conviction and throw this bad individual behind bars, but this relief is very victim-centered. This is out there for the victim. So it does not rely on a defendant being identified, arrested, or prosecuted. It doesn't even have to be a prosecution going on. If the victim can't be located or seems uncooperative later, we can revoke it. We can revoke a certification. There's a special number for certifying officials that you can call USCIS. And you can get a hold of them and let them know the reasons why you want to revoke that. It takes a lot. I think if you're really educated on this relief and what it is and what it isn't, I really think that it takes a whole lot to get to that point, because helpfulness, which is one that we tend to kind of key on, that second one that I talked about, our likely being helpful in the detection, the prosecution, all that stuff, that's deep with us. Like that resonates with us, because to be helpful is to help me get my conviction that I want, right, Jane? To get that arrest warrant that I want. But we have to remember that helpfulness, it doesn't have to go through that entire process to conviction. Helpfulness is just showing that person at some point, or they still are, or if maybe we get some more information, such as a DNA hit, that they are likely to be helpful in our investigation. And if they're not, the best part of this is, and what we've learned, God, for all the years we've been doing this work, we've learned about the reasons why the victims of these crimes we're talking about sometimes don't participate fully, right? They don't want to cooperate. All the really, really good reasons why they don't count here. So they may not want to be helpful. They, the next day after that 911 call, they may slam the door in my face as an investigator, because they started to think overnight, oh my God, he's going to get to my family, in Venezuela. I'm going to get deported. I'm not going to get to see my kids. And then they don't want to talk to us. They recognize that when they put this together. So that's fine. That's okay. So I would never just go and call up and reject my certification because a victim wasn't cooperating without some substantial information that shows that person not being cooperative was unreasonable. And I think when you look at this, the information and the things that are going on, the majority of the time, I think Jane, you'll agree with me, their lack of cooperation to what we want for our case is pretty reasonable. Why it is that way. I guess I'll just leave it at that. And then when should I sign it? The answer is as soon as possible. As soon as possible. And that's why, obviously in my work, being an investigator and law enforcement partner in this work that we do, we're boots in the field. We're having very early access to information and survivors and undocumented individuals in our community. So it doesn't take a whole lot to get enough information to be able to sign this. We want to do that on the front end. And again, nothing, Jane, you know where I'm going. And we work together. But there are prosecutorial agencies around the country. I've had to personally interact with some situations in my community where the prosecutors may want to hold off and wait and make sure that the case is going forward and the victim's coming into court and that kind of stuff before it's signed. And that's problematic. And I think I'm not going to chew on Jane's cabbage here. I think, Jane, you're going to get into that in just a little bit. But I guess my message is have a conversation. And hopefully that conversation comes to a good result at the end when you have it. But ultimately, as a police officer that's been identified as somebody that can sign these certifications for my agency, I'm not holding off on signing if I have the information to do it. Yeah, would I love to have a whole lot more information? Yes. Do I want to have this person come in to every interview that I'm looking for? Maybe bring the kids in even, who knows? Yes, I do. But it's not up to me to hold this 918B form hostage until I get what I need or what I want for my case. And hopefully that makes sense. We can expand on that. But this is a victim-centered form of relief. And I think it's a benefit just to get the information on that bad individual in your community. Because when you look at those crimes, these are the most dangerous people in our community. And they're not just doing it with this individual in the shadows of that situation. They're doing other things in our community as well. And that's probably my time. That.
No, I think that's great. And I appreciate you leaving time for me to chew on my own cabbage. I don't know what that idiom was, but the signing and the timing of the signing, this is a place where I've just got to say to the prosecutors, think about the pluses and the minuses if we want to get to that. First off, you have an ethical responsibility to share with the defense that somebody is seeking this relief, whether you sign it or not. So you're opening up that already. So you might as well sign it and deal with it. And secondly, we know that one of the biggest, challenges is, locating our victims, having them come to court. If this relief is signed, that U visa is signed, that means I have a partnership with not only the victim, but a victim attorney, an immigration attorney, a victim service provider. And now I've got a team that will help me be able to bring that victim into court and testify, because they're keeping contact with them. They're continuing to give them services, and they're advising them that, frankly, this is something that can be revoked. And so their likeliness that they are going to be able to participate is a lot higher. So we'll save some of the deeper questions for the roundtable, but I'm going to be on that soapbox with you, Mike. So you and I on that together. And, the IACP, which is the International Association of Chiefs of Police, I think the National Sheriff's Association has put something else very similar.
They've adopted a very similar resolution as well.
Perfect.
So basically, they're just really, they're leaders in this country under the law enforcement umbrella in providing training and opportunities. And they're basically saying we recognize it as a crime fighting tool. It's a best practice. They support training, education, communication, and leadership involvement in U visa relief, and then increasing collaboration. So it's a great thing when you have a national organization like IACP and, again, National Sheriff's Association come out and make a proclamation like this so all the other leaders around the country can see that this is an important thing that we need to pay attention to, I guess.
Yeah. And, not everyone on this call, and I know in my role, I wasn't going to be able to make policy change in my office all by myself. So this would be something I'd want to take to my supervisors and be like, hey, it's not just me, Jane Anderson, that's like, we need to do this, but like, this is internationally and nationally recognized as best practices. So that can help you. And Elizabeth kind of mentioned it already in the chat. And of course, at the end of all of this is like, okay, we hear all these really positive things. We're building trust and we're rapport with victims that we're serving, communities that we're serving. We hear across the board that's the most important thing for us to do when we're trying to tackle crimes of this type. We're protecting victims and survivors from the offender. As you dig in deep into what that U visa does, is not only just filing that application can put a little red flag in a system, which means that this offender can no longer call and try to get this victim deported. If DHS wanted to look up this person, it's going to have a big red flag that says, no, you cannot deport. And this person is the offender listed on this application. So you're protecting that person from deportation even before they get the visa itself, just filing that application. Because frankly, there is a long waiting list. And again, we can get into that more. So all of those are such positive things. And the one thing that I consistently hear is, well, what about my case? And first off, we already learned that this is not about my case and my prosecution. Yes, that is collaterally something that U visas should be able to enhance, but this is a victim-centered program, so I should not be having that as my primary concern. But I do need to have, like everything else, tools in my toolbox. So we know this is coming. We know the defense is going to try to make a big deal about this. So how can we do an offender-focused prosecution and make sure offenders are held accountable? Well, one thing prosecutors do all the time is we take our whatever challenging facts we have in a case and we try to build them into our strengths. So in this case, one of the challenges is going to be our victim is undocumented. Well, how do we turn that into the strength? Well, I encourage you to go back to the power and control wheel or that perfect plan and think about, how am I going to tell this story to the judge and the jury? Well, I'm going to talk about offender-focused themes and why the offender chose this victim, why the offender chose this type of abuse, and why the offender thinks he's going to be able to get away with it. Because I can tell you, juries hate it when I tell them, hey, you know what? The defendant thinks he's going to get this one over you. Judges, juries don't like that. So how can I kind of imbue this into my case? So I can talk about victim selection. Why did this victim choose this particular victim? Was it because they know that victim's undocumented? Maybe it's somebody that they met overseas and brought here on a fiance visa. We see that case, those cases a lot. In the south of Miami-Dade County where I worked, there was a bunch of armed robberies that were right outside a check cashing store on a Friday in an agricultural area where it was known that a lot of migrant victims were migrants were working. And they thought, oh, this is the perfect place for me to commit these armed robberies. So maybe it's part of victim selection. I want to talk about it. Maybe it's part of the criminal act itself. So that power and control wheel, how many of those tactics that the offender is employing are directly related to the victim's immigration status? Or why are some of those behaviors that, the jury may be having a hard time understanding, like cases, calling 911 and not following through, or trying to get a civil protection order and dropping it, or, whatever those sort of victim behaviors are that are really common responses to this type of trauma. Maybe the immigration status explains that, and I want the jury to better understand that. Or is this something that the offender used to try to get away from accountability? So did the offender use this as a way to prevent the victim from reporting the crime or for following through with the investigation? So really take a deep dive into your case, because more often than not, especially if the victim and the offender know one another, that offender knows the victim better than anyone else and better than us as investigators and prosecutors will ever know. We're hoping to get to know them through our multidisciplinary collaboration, but that offender knows them. They know the buttons to push. They know how to get what they want. So it's incumbent upon us to really recreate that reality in front of our judge or our jury. And so we might want to be talking about immigration. There are going to be cases where the offender and the victim don't know each other, and immigration is just it's just absolutely irrelevant to the case. Then we can file pretrial motions to have it excluded or to have it limited. So our tools as prosecutors is to be very analytical about our case, file pretrial motions, not only to make sure we know what's coming in and out, but that we're also educating our judge about things that they may not understand. Judges aren't receiving, although NUOP's doing a great job, judges aren't normally receiving training on U visas and what is discoverable and what is admissible in court. So we need to use pretrial motions to educate our judges. We need to start educating our jury and also identifying biases during our jury selection. That differs across the country and something that I do a lot of work with prosecutors one-on-one on. And then our witness testimony. How are we going to have the victim talk about, their hopes and their dreams and what the effect of deportation would mean to them and why these threats and why these tactics were so effective because of the layers of their vulnerability. We may want to use expert testimony to demystify some of the things about immigration relief, or even to better understand victim behavior. And then, of course, effective closing arguments. So we've got a lot of tools, and we've just got to make sure that we're strengthening them so that they're specific to our case and that we're educating our judge and our jury. So we've got some written resources on that as well. And again, I said I do a lot of case consultations on that particular topic. But as we close out this webinar as a standalone webinar, hopefully, that offender-focused investigation means let's identify and document what the offender is doing to assert power and control over their immigrant victims, looking at all those spokes in the wheel and not just the most immediate ones that are, right in our face as we're, getting brought to the scene or doing an investigation into a violent act or a sexually violent act. And then understanding the U visa, so many resources that NUOP has, all the ins and the outs, all the really specific questions. But the most important one is that we enhance victim safety and we increase their stability when we certify those U visas early. And we all know that when victims feel emotionally and physically safe, and when they're stable, they're so much more likely to be able to participate in our investigations and prosecutions. And then it's incumbent upon the prosecutors, not on the victims, but it's the prosecutor's job to present these cases effectively in court. And a lot of that means taking what might on the surface look like a challenge into a strength and telling that story and recreating that reality for victims of domestic and sexual violence when we have immigrant victims. So again, another reminder about our roundtables. One is happening right now. The link is in the chat. And then of course you can sign up to know about them. Every other month, Mike and I will host them, and they're really a great opportunity to talk about even like case specific issues.
Yeah, so
That's
hopefully
me.
everybody can join us.
Yeah, I think we're just popping over there right now, Mike.
We're gonna pop over there. Yep, just definitely a shout out. Thank you so much to the National Council of Juvenile Family Court Judges for providing this platform for us to do this. So, Brian, thank you, and our interpreters, and obviously NUAP staff, and especially Rocio and Maria, who did a lot of work to help us make this happen today. So, let's rock and roll and get over to our other question and answer session, and we'll get right at it. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Mike and Jane. The link is on the chat, guys. If you want to just go ahead and click on that, and then we
Okay.
can have an interactive discussion on the topics that we talked about today. Jane said bye. You want to go ahead and click? I'll stay here in case somebody has questions, but go ahead and go over there, Mike. Join us on the roundtable. Let's see, I'm gonna do it too.
Thank you. For those still here, the link's in the chat, and I'm going to end this webinar so you can all move over to the other Zoom link. Thanks so much. Have a great day.